This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special show on the violence in Syria. If you listen to the United Nations and Arab League envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan, then a deal has been struck to end the bloodshed there. Annan says that Damascus has pledged to withdraw all its units from towns by April the 10th to pave the way for a ceasefire deal with rebels 2 days later. But not everyone is convinced that President Bashar al Assad will keep to his word. Western diplomats express skepticism about Damascus's intent to halt its year-long assault on opponents. Activists say the government has killed more than 10,000 civilians in a brutal crackdown. Damascus says it is fighting a rebel insurgency. Russia, a long-term ally of Assad, has obstructed Western and Arab pressure through the UN Security Council. On Monday, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned against ultimatums and artificial deadlines. So, are we likely to see the end of the Syrian conflict within 7 days? After so much death and destruction, could a deal really be forged between the opposition and the government? And does the split between Russia and the West on Syria mean no international pressure can be brought to bear on Damascus? To discuss these big questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Abdul Wahab Omar, a Syrian opposition activist, Sabah al-Mukhtar, an Arab affairs analyst, Mohammed Entabli, an independent Middle East analyst, and Yevgeny Satanovsky, president of the Institute of the Middle East. Okay, to start the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Will Assad stick to the Annan deal and withdraw his forces? Maybe you, Abdul Wahab Omar, first of all.
I strongly believe that he will possibly pretend to do so, but it will soon become apparent that this is a short-lived measure and his forces will continue to violently suppress the popular uprising. Okay, Sabah, do you think there's any credence in Assad's words?
Well, there is credence in Assad's word, but at the same time it depends on whether the Western powers and the outside world is going to continue to interfere or not. I think that's the crucial rather than the statements.
But to answer the question, do you think he will withdraw his forces from towns by the 10th?
If there are no military action in these towns.
And Mohammed, maybe we can get an answer from you.
I think he hasn't kept his word on any other issue before or any other thing they presented to him. So I don't think he will keep his word this time either.
Okay, fair enough. And Yevgeny, how do you view it?
As every president in every country will do, what will depend on the local situation. If the military activity of his opponents will stop, that will start the peace negotiation based on the Kofi Annan plan. If not, that will be prolonging of civil war, which first stage he wins.
I'd like to jump in there and suggest that we've got two people who don't really have much stock in Assad's words, and we've got two guests who sort of equivocated, but it doesn't seem that anybody does think that he will automatically withdraw his forces by the 10th. It doesn't seem that even if you take a pro-Assad position, you think he's going to do that. Maybe I'll put that to you, Sabah.
Because I think this is an unrealistic proposition. The situation at the present moment in Syria is that the government claims, we don't know whether it's true or not, they are claiming to respond to what they call the insurgency and others call it revolution, but certainly there is use of force by others within Syria, whether it's the Syrian Free Army or outsiders.
Yevgeny, do you agree with that? Because you also had a slightly equivocating position, perhaps.
What's our agreement or disagreement? The only Assad is unhappy that there isn't this World League of Arab Nations and United Nations organization. Abraham Lincoln, whose civil war cost more than 600,000 Americans. Algerian military junta with 200,000 people who were killed during civil war in Algeria put another standard situation on the political table. The civil war in Syria is reality. All other aspects of the situation, including Kofi Annan plan and our talk show, are not more than some discussion around reality. If I'll be on the place of Bashar al Assad, I think I'll orient only on the real situation on the field, rather than on the so-called world community. Because he had experience of Muammar Gaddafi, and this experience means that he will stay to his end.
Abdul Wahab Omar, you said that Assad will probably only pretend to keep to his word. Your skepticism can be possibly echoed by Susan Rice, Washington's ambassador to the UN. She said, "We have seen promises made and promises broken. We have seen commitments to end the violence followed by massive intensification of violence. The proof is in the actions, not the words." Do you have a similar position? You're unlikely to be convinced?
Very much so. I mean, this is probably the third time that we get such a statement. The first one was done by Bashar himself when he uplifted or withdrew emergency law in the country at the very beginning of this uprising. We, in theory, in Syria now is a country where you should not be able to arbitrarily detain people or arrest them or even shoot at civilians, and this is still ongoing. Even as he made his promise, only yesterday, I can show you footage right now of military forces, Assad's forces, storming a university, the University of Aleppo. This is not Homs or Idlib or Daraa, this is Aleppo, which is supposed to be a city in which he enjoys relative support. Storming the campus, storming the dormitories, and conducting mass arrests of students simply because they held a sit-in. This is not a president who is prepared to actually put the only weapon that he knows how to use, and that's the weapon of force.
Sabah, how do you respond to that? I mean, that's like a direct allegation against Assad, claiming that he has to go.
Well, I think probably the biggest problem we have is that this is a propaganda warfare being waged between Syria and their enemies. And the enemies are, and I'm not talking about the Syrian people because this is their country. They are entitled to remove the regime, but I'm talking about those people who are now on higher moral grounds like Cameron, like Sarkozy, like the Americans, who care absolutely nothing about human rights anywhere, and suddenly they have become all hot under the collar for human rights of the Syrians, when in fact all of them at all of the times have made promises and they broke their promises, and they have abused everything from Afghanistan to Iraq to nuclear to the weapons of mass destruction of our Tony Blair here in this country. The idea that suddenly we have to apply to the Syrians a very high standard, that's the Syrian regime, whether it's Assad or the Ba'athist, it doesn't matter. A very high standard to the extent that we even ban his wife from doing the shopping. Maybe Assad has committed crimes. What did his wife do? Why can't Sherry Blair be banned from traveling or shopping, or the same thing for Obama's wife or any of these? So this is a propaganda warfare, and that is what is
Okay. It's a propaganda warfare. You're skeptical about Western hypocrisy. Fair enough. But throwing it back at you, you're saying that these politicians, they don't really care about the human rights situation in Syria. I put the question to you. Do you care about the human rights of the Syrian people?
Oh, absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind that we have to protect the human rights in Syria. I think the regime in Syria is willing to kill half the Syrians to stay in power, but I think those who are talking on the outside are willing to kill all of the Syrians to get rid of the regime. So this idea that somehow somebody is protecting the human rights and the other one is abusing it is a nonsensical exercise, because this is what is being done before in Libya, what's been done in Iraq, what's done in Afghanistan, in Gaza, and we can have a long list of these exercises where people were claiming that they're looking after human rights, but at the same time they were abusing it to an extent that the Americans have a something called Guantanamo, which is a virtual prison with a virtual people. So this is nonsense suddenly for them to try and begin to tell us that the regime of a country, whichever, should not protect the civilian lives from those who are using arms. You have an army here being financed and being given weapons by outsiders. Under any rules of any country, those are traitors.
Okay, fine. The West is hypocritical. What answers do you propose?
Well, what I think is the West should allow the opposition to actually try and resolve the problem with the regime, rather than banning them from even talking to them. The situation in Northern Ireland, the British government had to talk to the IRA. There are all sorts of previous examples. So the idea that suddenly we can't talk to Bashar al Assad because his hands are full of blood of people, as if This is the first time that you would do that. This is, again, it's another one. Even on the domestic level, if you have a hostage taker, the police actually discuss the issues with the hostage taker to try and get him to do something rather than just shoot him as they did in France.
Okay, Abdul Omar wants to say something in the studio, but first of all, I want to get some comment from you, Mohammed, on the line, Mohammed Entabli. How do you respond to what Sabah was saying there?
Well, I just would like to say to him that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will definitely make a violent revolution inevitable. And the seed of any revolution is repression, and we've been under repression since '63. Name me one country where the president has passed his power to his son, except in North Korea. We've been under the dictatorship of this family for 42 years, and we have tried everything possible in the book to make peaceful changes, and we have failed over and over again because this government adopts only one strategy, and that is the strategy of repression. Everybody who comes up with anything which is not agreeing with them, then therefore he is immediately either a traitor or being put in prison. The amount of pain they have inflicted on us for the last 42 years has led to all of this. And I would like to say also it is impossible to predict the time and progress of this revolution in terms of people are saying it's going to be a civil war. Who are they to say that it is going to lead to a civil war? We've never had a civil war in the history of Syria. Why are they frightening everybody by this propaganda? So I really don't agree with what he is saying. The revolution is a struggle to death between the future and the past, and we will never go to the past. We will never be under this oppression again.
And Mohammed, do you think that it's acceptable for foreign countries to support what you call a revolution?
Yes. Well, it's happened everywhere in the world. Why is it? They did it in Tunisia. They did it in Libya. They did it in Egypt. I'm not saying to take the same example and the same way they have interfered, but why is it wrong to support our claim for this revolution?
Okay, and I'll let Abdul Wahab Omar come in, because I know you wanted to say something too.
Yes, I'm going to try to bring these two comments together. So the Syrian people are not right now trying to bring in the outside world because that's the plan. We would have loved this to have been an issue that we can resolve within our own borders. But Bashar al Assad and his government, who Mr. Al Mukhtar here is supposed that we go into dialogue, does not even recognize as an opposition. Al Ja'fari yesterday was saying these are terrorists. So how does he expect us to enter into a dialogue when before we even enter he calls us terrorists, including us, normal Syrians? We're not Americans, we're not British, we are Syrians. And we would have loved this issue to have been solved within our neighborhood. We would have loved Iraq, we would have loved Turkey, we would have loved our neighbors or the Arab League in general to have helped us to resolve this, but they have failed. The fact that this has become an international problem now is because Assad wanted it to become an international problem.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria. I'm joined by Abdul Wahab Omar, a Syrian opposition activist, Sabah al-Mukhtar, the Arab affairs analyst, Mohammed Entabli, an independent Middle East expert, and Yevgeny Satanovsky, president of the Institute of the Middle East. Okay, maybe I'd like to get Yevgeny back in there. Maybe we could just pick up on what Abdul Wahab Omar was just saying.
We really have a big problem for the international community and the Syrian situation. This is the problem of export of the Islamic revolution organized by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. This is a problem of double standards based on which the Sunni Wahhabite-style regimes can occupy Bahrain or kill Shias in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, or be sponsors of Al-Qaeda, or provoking revolutions or some military putches in the whole Arab world organizing the new Caliphate, which will really dramatically and terribly change the Arab world. This is the problem of international community. Maybe the bigger problem is the role of Western world, which is now the dog under the command of Saudi Arabian and Qatar tails. But looking at the situation, it's quite better than we have in 56 in Sinai campaign. In United Nations is the same. China and Russia against United States, Great Britain and France. But there is no Mao Zedong with millions of volunteers, and there is no Khrushchev with atomic bomb. So, if anybody can win the civil war in Syria and be the new president or something like that, why not? Welcome. If not, Assad is a president, and he tries to stop this civil war by the methods which every president can.
So, Yevgeny, what's your point? I mean, I understand your point broadly about international affairs, but when it comes to, within Syria, are you just saying that, well, there's a civil war and the two sides have to slug it out, doesn't matter how many people die, but eventually one side's going to win? Is that it? Is that the way you look at it?
This is civil war just now. On one side, this is government and the elite part of the army. On another side, we have no side. Different groups, different leaders, different ambitions on different countries, plus Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Western Bloc, and Al-Qaeda, which is their ally in this civil war, not more.
Just so I could get a bit of a clearer understanding, it's almost like you advocate for nothing. I don't understand what your point is.
No, well, that's what we do have. Kofi Annan tried doing something. Will it be possible or not? I'm absolutely not sure, because if the fight against Assad, if al-Zarqawi and his Al-Qaeda, will they respect Kofi Annan's plan? I'm not sure.
Saba, maybe you want to comment.
I would like to make 3 quick points. Point number 1, I think it would be a misnomer and it's a wrong analysis to try and say the Arab Spring, the revolution in all these countries are Islamist or whatever other colors. Even the idea that although Saudi Arabia and Qatar, suddenly they have decided now to breach the charter of the Arab League, breach the Arab Defense Treaty, which they are signatories to it, by actually paying money and sending arms or calling for it in a revolution in another country. Despite that, I think it's a misnomer to try and label any of these in this way. The second thing is that I think in Syria, actually, at the present moment, we have a real civil war. There are every day something like 100 people dying, and I think this is the state of a civil war. 3, in terms of discussing with the regime, maybe the regime doesn't want to discuss with the opposition. But it is incumbent on the opposition, if they are patriots, if they worry about their country and they don't want to destroy it, then they should force the regime to talk to them, i.e., set up, instead of going to Istanbul, put them on a plane with Kofi Annan and go and discuss with the Syrians. Force the regime, Assad and his lot, to talk to them. The idea that we don't talk to them, that the West, but I think the West does not allow them. Actually, there is a ban, there is a veto by both Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and indeed the Western power on any of the opposition discussing with the regime, and the regime actually don't want to discuss with them.
Okay, Saba, but let's follow it through. They all sit down at a big table, the opposition, the Assad government. They talk about it, they talk and talk and talk. What does a solution look like? What is this political solution that everyone's talking about?
There are a number of issues which they can agree on. For instance, how would the Ba'ath Party no longer be the ruling party? How would you have free election? How would you allow the people out of prison? How would you disarm the people? It's not possible under any circumstances to allow factions of the army to carry arms against their own national army. This is unacceptable by any standard. And lastly, I think it is not possible for the outside world, for the United Nations or the other countries, to actually dictate on any country what government they have, and for them to stand there and say, this regime has lost legitimacy and this group can represent the people of Syria. This is all load of rubbish. It's nothing to do with reality. The world at the present moment cannot interfere in the affairs of Syria, not militarily and not otherwise. The only way is for the Syrians, whether they are in opposition or they are in government, and let's not forget, there are 2 oppositions. There are the people who are within Syria, and there are the people who are outside Syria. That's the National Coordination Committee, and the other one is the Syrian National Council. And I think that they should be talking at least in the same tone, while at the present moment they are not. And from my experience as an Iraqi, when I saw the Iraqi opposition when they were outside working with the outside, I know where they are heading. Those people, I know many of the people in Syria, both on the two sides.
And what's that conversation going to be, though? I mean, it's going to be opposition groups saying, Assad, you must step down and relinquish power, and Assad's going to be saying, no, I'm not going to. I mean, it's a clear deadlock, isn't it?
No, it isn't. You are making a presumption here. It's not the idea that you step aside and I sit in your place. They're going to work out how would you have the proper election, because at the present moment they've changed the laws and then nobody wants to take the part in the election. The opposition is saying, oh, this is all a gimmick, it's not true. The government is pretending it is a real election when they have a civil war on their hand. But I think the negotiations, if there is, one of the things is to stop, for instance, the fighting between the two armies. That is the army which has broke off from the main army. The stopping the financing and for the armament. Getting all the prisoners out of prison. Removing all the army units as Kofi Annan has called for. But it can only be pulled out if the areas where they should be pulling out, there will be no use of force against either civilians or the government agency. So this is what the discussion would be about.
And in a one-word answer, does that mean that Assad remains president?
He is at the present moment, there is a de facto situation. He is in power, the Ba'ath Party is in power, all the thugs within the regime are still in power. The idea that somehow we dismiss them because Mrs. Clinton doesn't like them or Sarkozy and they don't exist, and we have leaders of the opposition making pronouncement, this is not realpolitik. This is, everybody is playing gimmick for the Western powers to keep on talking about the exercise, because actually they do not. The West now, economically, militarily, cannot repeat the performance of Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria and a possible deal in the making. I'm joined by Abdul Wahab Omar, a Syrian opposition activist, Sabah al-Mukhtar, the Arab affairs analyst, Mohammed Entabli, an independent Middle East expert, and on the line from Russia by Yevgeny Satanovsky, president of the Institute of the Middle East. Perhaps I'll turn to you in the studio, Abdul. We were just hearing from Sabah. He was talking realpolitik. He was talking about what a solution might look like. It was presenting a fairly credible suggestion of what this dialogue might resemble. How do you respond to that?
I think we have too many political analysts that tend to sometimes suffer from short-term memory loss. This uprising has not just started. This uprising has been happening for over a year now. At the very beginning of this uprising, what we had was peaceful demonstrations. We had a regime that did not tolerate a few school children spraying some graffiti on the walls, and they were arrested and had their nails pulled out. We had a one-way slaughter, and the whole world recognized that. People of Syria sought help, asked the international community for outside assistance. And every pan-Arabist jumped and said, no, we don't want the outside world to intervene. Then they said, okay, some of us have defected, some of us are prepared to risk their lives and defend the civilian population. We label them as terrorists. What is there a recipe? If we are not going to stand for the basic human rights principle of self-defense, if we are not going to protect them and not allow Syrians to protect themselves, how? And we have a president who does not see the opposition. He only sees everybody as a germ or a terrorist. How are we expecting any form of negotiation to take place? We've tried it. For the first 6, 7, 8 months of the uprising, there was no form of violence. It was people on the streets. It was school children. It was universities. It was men and women. And it continues to be. Until now, even universities, just students, not militants, are being killed on a daily basis. How can we be given a recipe for suicide and expect to just abide by it?
And Mohammed, I want to throw that one over to you. We've got two very different opinions. We've got Abdul Wahab Omar saying there really can't be any negotiated solution, and Sabah al-Mukhtar proposing a way forward in that direction. But what do you think?
I just would like to say that in Iraq, they could not really get rid of Saddam or al-Ba'ath Party until somebody interfered. And in their new constitution, in fact, they did not allow al-Ba'ath Party even to exist, to take part in any political life in Iraq. So I really don't understand how he come up with something like this at all. How could you speak to somebody who has been repressing your own people for decades? We've had only one view since '63 from al-Ba'ath Party, and that is the view of the dictator. and dictate to people what they can and cannot do. And we had no option at all to discuss or collaborate with them on any way. And he knows that. Everybody knows that. So how could you really now tell me that I could trust these people and sit down with them in order to negotiate a way out of this situation? I am not for violence. I don't want my country to go into a civil war at all. I don't want to see my people being killed on a daily basis. I would like to stop that yesterday. But could anybody really let me know? Is there anybody out there who could tell me how you could speak to such people and come to any agreement with them? I really find that this is an absurd, really, suggestion.
And obviously very, very divergent views, but maybe I'll throw it over to you, Yevgeny. We're running out of time, but it seems to be 2-1 on whether or not there can be a political solution. What do you think?
Well, that's real situation, which means that you have president who is, of course, a dictator, as all leaders on Africa or Middle East. No one who is not a dictator. And if anybody wants to change the country, he must have a dialogue with the power he has, or win the civil war, or go to hell. 3 options. Everybody decide himself. And no one international force, no one outsider will not change the situation in Syria. That's only Syrian problem.
Okay, Sabah, I'm going to let you get back in here. As I say, we're running out of time, but you've had 2 pretty concrete guests describing why they don't think your plan is a way forward.
Maybe they don't, but I'm trying to advise them that they don't fall into the trap, that their brethren, the Iraqis who worked with the Western powers in Iraq to liberate Iraq. By the way, there is a difference because Iraq was going to be occupied. That's a different issue. But the net result is that the interference of the Western powers in Iraq ended with more killing in Iraq, destruction of the country, possible division in the country. Syria is heading that way unless they actually wake up. And the idea that suddenly you can't speak to somebody, this is not a solution because the regime doesn't want to speak to them and they don't want to speak to the regime. But whoever is the patriot is the one who should leave no step not to be taken, and they must try and talk.
That was Sabah Al-Mukhtar, the Arab Affairs analyst, saying that there should be at least another last-ditch attempt to forge some kind of political deal to end more than 1 year of violence in the troubled Middle Eastern country. I was also joined by Abdul Wahab Omar, a Syrian opposition activist, Mohammed Entabli, an independent Middle East expert, and on the line from Russia by Yevgeny Satanovsky, president of the Institute of the Middle East. What are the big issues you'd like to hear debated on The Voice of Russia in London? Why not send us an email to uk@ruvr.ru. That's uk@ruvr.ru. I'm James Reinl, bringing you our daily discussion show. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Stay tuned. Do you agree with that? Because you also had a slightly equivocating position, perhaps.
What's our agreement for disagreement? The only Assad is unhappy that there is in this world League of Arab Nations and United Nations organization. Abraham Lincoln, whose civil war cost more than 600,000 Americans. Algerian military junta with 200,000 people who were killed during civil war in Algeria put another standard situation on the political table. The civil war in Syria is reality. All other aspects of the situation, including Kofi Annan plan and our talk show, are not more than some discussion around reality. If I'll be on the place of Bashar al Assad, I think I'll orient only on the
stick to the Annan deal and withdraw his forces. Maybe you, Abdul Wahab Omar, first of all.
I strongly believe that he will possibly pretend to do so, but it will soon become apparent that this is a short-lived measure and his forces will continue to violently suppress the popular uprising.
Okay. Sabah, do you think there's any credence in Assad's words?
Well, there is credence in Assad's word, but at the same time it depends on whether the Western powers and the outside world is going to continue to interfere or not. I think that's the crucial rather than the statements.
But to answer the question, do you think he will withdraw his forces from towns by the 10th?
If there are no military action in these towns.
And Mohammed, maybe we can get an answer from you.
I think he hasn't kept his word on any other issue before or any other thing they presented to him. So I don't think he will keep his word this time either.
Okay, fair enough. And Yevgeny, how do you view it?
As every president in every country will do.
This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special show on the violence in Syria. If you listen to the United Nations and Arab League envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan, then a deal has been struck to end the bloodshed there. Annan says that Damascus has pledged to withdraw all its units from towns by April the 10th to pave the way for a ceasefire deal with rebels 2 days later. But not everyone is convinced that President Bashar al Assad will keep to his word. Western diplomats express skepticism about Damascus's intent to halt its year-long assault on opponents. Activists say the government has killed more than 10,000 civilians in a brutal crackdown. Damascus says it is fighting a rebel insurgency. Russia, a long-term ally of Assad, has obstructed Western and Arab pressure through the UN Security Council.
What will depend on the local situation. If the military activity of his opponents will stop, that will start the peace negotiation based on the Kofi Annan plan. If not, that will be prolonging of civil war, which first stage he wins.
I'd like to jump in there and suggest that we've got two people who don't really have much stock in Assad's words, and we've got two guests who sort of equivocated, but it doesn't seem that anybody does think that he will automatically withdraw his forces by the 10th. It doesn't seem that even if you take a pro-Assad position, you think he's going to do that. Maybe I'll put that to you, Sabah.
Because I think this is an unrealistic proposition. The situation at the present moment in Syria is that the government claims, we don't know whether it's true or not, they are claiming to respond to what they call the insurgency, and others call it revolution, but certainly there is use of force by others within Syria, whether it's the Syrian Free Army or outsiders.
Yevgeny, so on Monday, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned against ultimatums and artificial deadlines. So, are we likely to see the end of the Syrian conflict within 7 days? After so much death and destruction, could a deal really be forged between the opposition and the government? And does the split between Russia and the West on Syria mean no international pressure can be brought to bear on Damascus? To discuss these big questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Abdul Wahab Omar, a Syrian opposition activist, Sabah al-Mukhtar, an Arab affairs analyst, Mohammed Entabli, an independent Middle East analyst, and Yevgeny Satanovsky, president of the Institute of the Middle East. Okay, to start the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Will Assad's